Usually, when someone says something is ahead of its time, they mean that in a good way. When someone says something is behind the times, they tend to mean that in a bad way. Anthem somehow sits in this space where both descriptions are and were accurate at the same time for both good and bad reasons. It's a game that is oddly confused and confusing whilst being somehow relatively straightforward. It's a paradox that has had its mark on the games industry in the last 5 years in ways its developers likely never suspected. Anthem launched on February 22nd, 2019, 5 years ago from a week or two ago, depending on how lazy I was with this edit and when you're watching. Either way, I think it's about time Anthem gets unearthed once more. Before getting into the game itself, it's worth looking at the context behind it. Though you might not know it now, BioWare was one of the kings of RPGs just a decade ago. With titles like Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, Jade Empire, Mass Effect and Dragon Age behind it, BioWare had a reputation for making grand epics with complex stories, meaningful choices, and worlds you want to live and breathe in. Mass Effect Andromeda had launched just before this and saw a huge knock to the public perception and confidence in BioWare. Anthem was its shot at redemption. With all eyes on BioWare, it's important to note that there are standards it will be held to that other developers aren't. Anthem didn't just have to be good to succeed, it had to be as phenomenal as BioWare's other games. A tall order. Another developer could have possibly tackled this world and not gotten the same vitriol, but when you set a standard, you have to match that standard, as unfair as that may be. Anthem had the unluckiness of the harsh standards of being from a veteran dev, but also fans were more willing to buy in, which is why it managed to sell 5 million copies despite its reputation. However, Anthem failed and was said to be going through a renovation in early 2020, only for that effort to be axed in 2021, and Anthem's revival was indefinitely paused. The world I got to when I bought it for £4 in December 2023 was dead, a few soldiers still hauling their shambling corpses around the battlefield as everyone else had long gone, evacuating a dying planet before it stops to exist. When I say Anthem is ahead of its time and behind the times, I mean its speedrun from live service to quote-unquote dead game is something oft repeated with the likes of Marvel's Avengers, Babylon's Fall and Knockout City over the next few years, but none quite left the bright light that Anthem did as it burned out. It wasn't the first game to fail to connect, but it felt like one of the biggest and most hopeful. This is illustrative of the story. Anthem's world is one constructed by and fundamentally dedicated to the Anthem of creation, a kind of energy that can be harnessed by gods to construct or destroy. Fundamentally unstable by its nature, at least to a simple MacGuffin for you and the big bad to tussle over until the final moments. You play a freelancer, someone who controls their own mech suit, who aims to get paid to protect Fort Tarsis from the inhabitants of the world around them that is fundamentally inhospitable. When the Dominion, a militaristic, power-hungry group of humans who unleashed a cataclysm on the world, aims to take control of a relic capable of unknown power, it is your job to stop them. This story is generic. It sets up a form of big bad, wraps the story around it, and throws a little more at you as you go, but it doesn't stray too far from its initial path. This isn't always a bad thing. In fact, the basic story of the first Mass Effect game isn't too complex in its pure merits, but it's what Mass Effect does with that background that makes the story worthwhile. Where most RPGs have you essentially tell yourself a story with the building blocks around you, Anthem, due to its very nature, doesn't quite have that privilege. RPGs are often a bit more of a it's not the destination but the journey kind of experience, yet Anthem's journey doesn't have the depth to avoid you wishing you could just ram the pedal down and hit 100. It actually starts off pretty well for the most part. The gameplay is smooth, it still looks really good for the era, and there's room for depth in its mechanics. As you were blasting through enemies and flying through areas, there's a feeling almost akin to that I had playing Spider-Man, the ability to tickle the brain just right to enjoy mindlessly flowing through the air. However, this fluidity comes apart at the seams as you're hit with menus, loading screens and more. The game is split up between first-person sections in the fort and third-person sections in the world. This, I think, is intended to make your interactions with the fort's inhabitants feel more personable and real. You are left to feel squishy and vulnerable without your suit, and NPCs are seen as vulnerable as a result. You even get some small dialogue choices that allow you to connect to others. This isn't a bad move for the world it wants to set up, but it often feels like busy work as you line up for your next mission and go. After just a handful of quests, you are hit with the first major roadblock. Challenge of the Legionnaires, as you go out into the world where you have to interact with a handful of crypts which you can only get into after doing certain objectives. These include finding world events, doing combos and more. Some of these objectives, like the combos, is essentially a tutorial to mechanics, which shows certain special attacks with elements, and using the right combination of attacks can result in bigger damage. This works. What doesn't work is every other part. World events come along randomly, so you are forced behind an arbitrary grind. As well as this, the task of reviving friendly players is even more difficult with lonely servers and the occasional server outage. You can only get a couple of people in each world at a time, which means just following people around and letting them die until you defeat the challenge. Anthem, due to its speedy exploration mechanics and fast-paced gunfights, is at its best on the go, so when it slows you down, it really slows you down. Anthem has one major map that you can free roam in with a couple of online players. Events pop up, small quests appear, and enemies can be shot down. I spent a lot of time in the free roam sections of the game for a reason we'll get back to later, yet I never felt myself really pulled to go in. There was little incentive to jump in that wasn't fueled by an arbitrary challenge or line going up. It is the grind at its grindiest, I suppose. In service of this grind, there isn't a battle pass, but there is an online store that you can sink currency into to get new cosmetics or, most frustratingly, much higher leveled gear. The store itself is personified by a storekeeper who has genuine banter with you. There's this strange moment I had while playing where those layers of the game started to peel back and I really fully realised this character I'm supposed to like is actively trying to sell me on digital currencies. This ties back to one of the more pervasive problems in Anthem, its structure. Those little things, the invasive stores, the split between a more single-player story focus and the fort and online live service shooter outside, these come together to make a game that feels lost, both tonally and mechanically. The guns and armor you find give small pluses to damage or shields, but don't really mean much in the grand scheme of things. Weapons feel the same after a while, and enemies tend to scale with you, so you are left more or less in the same loop, killing the same enemies, watching the same environments. One-off missions do shake up the formula somewhat by bringing you to smaller locations, dungeons and more, but I often found myself rushing through them, waiting for nearly a minute to load the fort, wear new gear and head back out immediately. Anthem sucked up my attention and didn't really give much back. The gameplay is pretty nice though. Every now and then I find myself in search of something big, something mindless, a collectathon, a grind to get lost in. Just something to accompany my mind. Anthem became a project for me over December for this reason. I wanted something no nonsense, and I mostly got it. However, attempting to get the platinum showed to me just how shallow everything is after a while. Initially, as you unlock new weapons and the 4 central suits come to the forefront, there's a level of depth to everything. You can only pick one suit at a time, and you unlock more to customize as you go along. This is a decent way to incentivize testing different suits and abilities at different times, as they have unique traits and skills. There's enough variety here for me to find testing them out fun, but not nearly enough to really contribute to team composition. This is mostly because, despite its marketing, Anthem is barely a multiplayer game. It's always online, and when servers go down you do, yet there's no real need for it. You can play almost the entire game solo if you don't find a match. It helps that, on higher difficulty levels, I just couldn't find one, so I was often forced into a single player mission. Challenges necessary for getting the platinum include getting a certain amount of kills with certain weapons, getting to the max level, and finding randomly generated notes and bits of lore. This means most who want the platinum end up committing to a single route that they farm over and over again until they get it. This is how I spent so much time in the free roam mode. Though this is indicative of how shallow the world of Anthem can feel, this isn't entirely BioWare's fault. Many platinum trophies make you do mindless tasks, but Anthem seems to go a step above. Despite days of complaining, promises I'll quit trying, and a few times almost deleting the game and moving on, I got the trophy and that was it. There's little endgame to enjoy here, few interesting missions when you've beaten the game, and the ending leads you up to a point that hints at something bigger that will never actually let you see it. This is a very hard question to answer. There is some charm under all the rubble that came from the remains of BioWare at the time. The gameplay genuinely has a nice feel to it and can be expanded on well, and aesthetically it is quite interesting. However, BioWare seemingly hasn't worked on a multiplayer title since this. It appears the dev is going back to its roots to an extent, with both the new Mass Effect title and Dragon Age Dreadwolf. There's a reasonable comparison to be made here to the likes of Destiny, a game from a huge dev going in a distinctly different direction with an interesting aesthetic and nice gameplay, but ultimately very shallow progression systems. However, it's worth pointing out that since Destiny in 2014, Bungie has worked on another Destiny game and 2 unannounced yet almost unheard of games for some point in the future. Anthem encapsulates a live service bubble that only really seems fit to pop around now. When the lights go out and the servers go down, nothing will be left of Fort Tarsus and the people whose lives you have changed in your little story. And Anthem 2.0 would have likely propelled it forward a few more years, but I can't help but wonder why it needed to go this direction in the first place. I don't necessarily know if we deserved an Anthem 2.0, but I don't know if the industry could even continue to support it long term if it did. Sometimes it's not worth putting all that love into a game that doesn't quite show that love back. More importantly, I think the question should be, would I recommend giving Anthem a try? Yes, for a little bit, I suppose. I just wouldn't bother with the platinum. Thank you so much for watching my Anthem video. If you liked it, please do give it a like and subscribe. I think I've hit 350 subscribers now, which is significantly higher than I thought I'd get by this point, so I feel really grateful that people seem to be clicking and it's getting on some people's recommended feeds, which is really cool. This video took forever because the platinum is atrocious in that game. I spent hours and hours just farming the same bits, telling myself, oh, it'd be good for a video, and then realizing that it's a 20-second throwaway comment in a much larger script, which sucks. But I suppose I'm glad that my pain got something fun. This was supposed to get out for the anniversary on the 22nd, but a ton of stuff held it back, and yeah, it's finally out now. So thank you for watching.